in the improv we were doing, I was like, it's actually more productive for me to just feel and explore what's happening in my body, register the sonic output, and then use that as material. So not only did that become a really cogent philosophy in my improvising, but it became a huge part of my composition. Like I started going back to the music I was writing and realizing, if I'm approaching improv this way, I bet, of course, every musician, every performer must be approaching their instrument in a similar way. Like there must be some sort of felt interstice of and usually it's what you're trying to avoid in many classical music styles, but there are these spaces that you can actually navigate to through your body, and that produce all sorts of fascinating results.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. How's it going, y'all? Welcome to the show today. If this is your first time listening, well, greetings. My name is Tyler. I'm a composer, a radio broadcaster, a producer, a podcaster. I wear lots of hats. And on this podcast, I sit down with other creatives to learn about their journey and discuss their process, philosophies, and just everything about their craft. And if you've been listening for some time now, welcome back. On today's Music Maker, I'm joined by composer James May, and y'all, this is a deep conversation that I've been really excited to share with you. James May is a composer, improviser, teacher, photographer, and writer whose work explores unfurling fragile spaces through notated scores, improvisation environments, live electronics, field recordings, extended vocal technique, and text. He's especially interested in combining techniques to encourage the exploration of new sounds or generate unpredictable systems in which performers can dwell. He's a member of Versipel New Music in New Orleans, has published writing in Sound American and RTE Culture, taught courses on music production techniques and field recordings at Tulane University, and is an active free improviser in the Gulf South. James is beginning a PhD in music and multimedia composition at Brown University in the fall of 2024. Like I said, this episode goes deep, and once you get to know James, you'll understand why. He just thinks about music and sound in some really brilliant ways, and we probably could have talked about it all day long. In this conversation, James shares how studying composition as an undergrad was really his only option to pursue music as a career, a departure from the typical path of music education or performance. We also bond over the way each of us entered the world of electronic and electroacoustic music. He discusses the transformative year that he spent studying experimental sound design in Cork, Ireland, how he broke away from approaching free improvisation with a composer's perspective, and how that in turn influences his compositional work today, and so much more. This is a big-time episode, folks, and I hope you dig it as much as I do. A little bit of business to share before we jump into this conversation. One of the simplest and indeed the best way to support this podcast is just by doing what you're doing now, listening to this episode, listening to earlier episodes, and then following the podcast on your favorite streaming platform. That'll ensure that you get the newest episode as soon as it's released, pushed straight to your device. Shout out to the Patreon fam. As of recording this episode, we've got 19 amazing Patreon supporters who make this podcast possible, and you can join them, support what we're doing on Patreon, and you'll get early access to episodes by becoming a subscriber for just $5 a month. And yes, that little bit of support goes a long way in helping me cover the cost of some of the tools that I use to produce this podcast. You can find a Patreon link and other ways to financially support the podcast on our website at looseleaftransmissions.com/support. And finally, an impactful and a free way to help the Music Maker podcast is to leave a rating and even a review if you feel inclined, on that app you're listening to the podcast on right now. The more reviews and ratings that we have, the more visibility this podcast has, the more discoverable it is, and the more that we are able to grow. So if you can take just a few minutes to do that, I would really, really appreciate it. All right, on to my episode with composer James May. Well, James, I'm really excited to talk with you today. I'm grateful for your time. And I think, we were talking a little bit before this, that I think you're the first fan of the podcast who has listened to every episode
Yeah.
and then been interviewed. So I'm really excited to see how you handle all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when Meet the Composer was still being put out with Nadia Sirota.
Yeah.
And I would listen to that and be like, what would I say? And obviously those composers were way, way ahead of me at the time that I was listening to that
Sure.
podcast. But it's fun. It's just I've always had fun talking about these things with my colleagues and peers. So it's nice to do it in a more formal situation.
Yeah, that's all this really is, and that's why I do it. So yeah. So as you know, as folks who have been listening for a while know, my first question that I ask everyone is, what is your earliest artistic memory as a composer? And you work so much with sound in general. I mean, that is composing, but also not necessarily composing. So I'll kind of broaden this up. What is your first memory of working with sound even?
It's interesting because I think some of the things that I'm interested in now, in that sort of more broadly sonic regard, I can see signs of it from my childhood, but I definitely meandered through the more typical composition route to get to what I'm doing today. So I think, as a composer strictly, when I was growing up, I wasn't in exactly a musical family in the sense of people were trained musicians, but I was in a very musical family in the sense that we all loved music, always something on the radio. My mom was and is a guitar player, but with sort of the Catholic folk music tradition. So she grew up playing in her church. When I was growing up, she was still playing in folk groups in the churches we were attending. So I was always surrounded by music making. It wasn't of the classical variety. And then, I did the sort of Catholic school thing from grade school through high school. And when I was in grade school, myself and my siblings all took piano lessons from the music teacher at the Catholic school. So I was doing a lot of music stuff as a kid. And I was thinking about it. And I think the very first compositional experience I had was actually, I was in Boy Scouts for, as so many boys in America were at some point in their life. And they had some merit badge weekend, and I did the music one. So I must have been in 5th or 6th grade when I did this. And part of the thing you had to do in the music one, that there was a sort of final project you had to do. And there was an obvious one, which was talk about a piece of music or bring in a piece of music. But there was another one that was compose a piece of music. And I had been taking piano lessons, and I was like, well, I don't know. I know how notation works. What if I just wrote something instead of reporting back on something else? And I have truly no sense of what that piece sounded like. It was probably some new age, D minor, 6/8 arpeggiation piece. But I do remember being the only person in that group who did that option.
Yeah, I gotta say, I did Boy Scouts, I think, for a year when I was in elementary school, and I don't remember anything musical about it. It was Pinewood Derby and camping and fishing, and I think that's what most of us think of when we think of the Boy Scouts and Eagle Scout kind of stuff. But
absolutely,
it's actually surprising to me to hear you share this.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why I wanted to do it was because even at that point in my life, I knew I was interested in music. And this was run out of Carnegie Mellon. So I grew up in Pittsburgh. And most of the sessions that weekend were build a bottle rocket and shoot it off in the quad, or, go build something. But they had this music option. And if you look at that full list of merit badges, those things are sort of strewn throughout because it's such a like old boys British, like,
Mm,
what does it mean to be a man of society organization from a particular
sure.
time, right? And in a way, there are things like music and the arts that were part of that identity. So yeah, I did the the music merit badge for whatever that was worth. And I think that was my first like that was my true first I made something experience. But I think perhaps more formatively, the first time that I was really consciously kind of creating my own music was I was playing piano throughout high school, just sort of on my own. And in late grade school, I got really into like punk and screamo
Mm,
by way of the really like dad, what would be considered now like the dad rock of the 2000s,
yeah.
like the hard rock bands that would play on alternative radio. And I started teaching myself electric guitar, and just by learning the songs I was listening to, and eventually started writing my own like breakdown, riffy, heavy songs.
Yeah.
And by writing my own, I mean I was writing the guitar part and some lyrics and imagining the other parts, and then
Yeah.
not following through on finding people or finding the instruments to make those other parts. But I think that was probably more in terms of continuity, the first compositional experience I had.
So it's always interesting to me to hear about folks's formative years, like through grade school and stuff. Because for me, it was, I was like a band kid. I did the band
Right.
thing, but that doesn't sound like necessarily like you even had that option.
No, well, it was interesting. So, like I mentioned, I went through the Catholic school system. I've been thinking about this a lot recently. So, we had like music class when I was in grade school, and that in some ways exposed me to a lot of the stuff that I would deal with later studying composition. Like we would listen to musicals, or you'd be exposed to like Fantasia,
Yeah,
uh,
right.
go to like do kids at the symphony, see the Star Wars music at the symphony, things like that. But my high school's music program was extremely small, and it was mostly the kids who wanted to do band who were playing for the marching band.
Mm,
There were some music theory classes that people took as a joke. It was like the thing that you took if you didn't want to do anything as a junior or senior. So my music education really started in college. And there's a whole like I have a lot of thoughts about that, but my primary formative musical experiences were sort of my own pursuit, like teaching myself guitar, continuing to play piano a little bit after I had stopped taking lessons. I did high school theater, so being
mm.
part of musicals. But the other really big thing for me was being in Catholic church groups. So, like in fifth grade, I joined the handbell choir.
Oh, yeah.
I was in, I mentioned my mom was in the folk group in our church. So I started playing first, I think first guitar actually with them, and then keyboard a little bit. I learned how to play drum kit actually in my Catholic church because there was one. And I was like, well, I don't know, it looks interesting. So every so often, if the drummer was gone, I would slowly learn that stuff. And sort of parallel to my interest in sort of post hardcore, loud, distorted guitar music, I also was composing for our handbell choir.
Okay. Yeah.
And that was another one of my first, that was probably my first public composition experience, was when I was a junior maybe in high school. I did an arrangement of a Green Day song for the handbell choir, and
I
then I
love that.
did, yeah,
Yeah.
it was like the concert version of Time of Your Life where he does the sort of like Paul Muty electric
Yeah.
guitar. And then the following year I wrote my own piece for the handbell choir. And we had a pretty good, it wasn't professional level, it was just community, but we were good enough that I like didn't have a sense of difficulty level.
Yeah,
I was
right.
like, I'll just put notes. So this is how we learned a piece. So I assume we'll just do the same thing with whatever I put on the page.
this is just a sidebar. Have you written for handbell choir since then?
No, I haven't. I mean, it's there are so many things that were such a part of my early experience as a musician and as a composer that as soon as I started in college and like in the sort of academic version of studying music, not that they fell by the wayside, but they just weren't a focus. And something like handbell choir, like my youngest sibling is still in the bell choir that
Mm.
has the one that I was in sort of morphed into as various like dioceses and churches close and merge and all that stuff. But no, I haven't written for handbells since then. But when I was listening to Shelley's episode, I was like, oh yeah, I know what I'm picking up what you're
Yeah.
putting down. Like I know what this world is.
Yeah, and Shelley's loves handbells so much that I think she's kinda like, "Let me know if you ever wanna write a piece, because 'cause I'll tell my mom to play it."
Right.
You know, so
And it's fun. And
yeah.
it's one of those things where, you know, because it was such a part of my life, I've only realized in the last 5 or 10 years that it is sort of another ecosystem of
Mm.
professional music making. You know, like the people who write music for the church is they're like that is such a world. And
Oh,
there are
yeah.
so many of those worlds. Like you talked about being in bands. That's one that I've never been in, but
Mm.
that I'm aware of. And I think growing up, one of the things that I struggled with was feeling like I didn't have the requisite education or the requisite experience or the requisite exposure to what I perceived as being professional musicians or having a career as a professional musician. But then my choir director, my church director, was one of the first people to tell me, like, I'm a professional musician. Like, I
Yeah.
make my living as a musician, that like that's what I do, and that this is one of the ways that if you want to do something like this is one of the ways that life could look.
Yeah. So, with all of this in mind, growing up through this Catholic education and maybe not having the same kind of access or access to the same kinds of things that maybe a lot of people we know had access to. When would you say your first encounter with a composer was? Was it through the church, or was
Yeah,
it not until
actually,
yeah.
it was so like one of the things in the Catholic Church, if you're not familiar, is that they still have sort of all of the parts of the Mass. So if you think back, if people listening went through sort of Western music education and you studied the parts of the Mass or the parts of the liturgy in old chant, the Catholic Church still does that. So you have like you sing the Gloria, you sing the Holy Holy, you sing like there are musical segments of the Mass that are considered writing a Mass. So
Mm.
in a different way than writing a Mass in the classical sense, this is like in the Catholic Church, they basically need the music for different segments of the liturgy. And my choir director wrote one, right? So like
Yeah.
like, just for variety, churches will just like swap out which mass they're doing each weekend. It's like, oh, I don't want to do that, or like that's boring. Or maybe they'll do one for one part of the year and a different one in another part of the year. And so my like very first encounter was, and I didn't even realize it, was like, oh, Norm's name is on this piece of paper. Like, I guess he
Yeah.
wrote this one that I've been singing for like my whole childhood. I just didn't know, which is interesting too, because it was such a just not rote, but it was so built into that world that I didn't even realize it at the time. I think my first encounters outside of that context were that there were a few ones. One of them was when I was in high school. I was part of a program that we would do these trips every year to like Washington, D.C. or Chicago or Boston. And we would meet with like former graduates from my high school.
Mm.
We would go to one of the universities for a lecture. We would meet with nonprofit, like it was this scholars program, and it was all about like I don't even know how to describe it quickly. But one of the things we did the first trip I went on as a sophomore was we were in DC and we went to the symphony, and they were playing, I think like banner piece was like Tchaik 4 or
Mm.
something like that. But there was a piano concerto in the middle, and it was by a living composer, and I had no idea what that meant at the time. I was like,
Yeah.
"Oh, cool. So like someone wrote this. That's neat." And because I knew nothing, I thought it was just so like fascinating. It was like, "Oh my god, I don't understand this at all, but this is really interesting." And then years later, I went back. I was like, "I wonder if I can find that program like now that I know what composition is."
Yeah.
And it was Jennifer Higdon.
Oh,
And it
nice.
was like, and she was there, and we went to a post-concert talk with her. And I mean, like, I had zero conception that that was what I was witnessing at the time.
Yeah.
And then when I was in college and I had already been introduced to Jennifer Higdon, like via, I think, what, Blue Cathedral,
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, I like saw one of her premieres when I was in high school.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing.
So I'd imagine at the point that you went to college, maybe you didn't know yet that you wanted to pursue a career as a composer. At what point did that happen? At what point were you like, actually, I want to do this for a living?
It actually did happen before college.
Okay. Yeah.
And basically what happened was like I was moving through high school, and I was a very good student, and I still am. And I am definitely one. I'm a person who demographically school works for, like it works to my advantage, and I liked being in school.
Yeah.
And I I had this sense as I was coming to the end of high school. I was like, look, the only thing I actually really love is music. And I think as people leave high school, oftentimes they sort of enter college with an idea of, well, whatever I'm good at, I'm going to keep doing that and sort of do one of the jobs that's an outburst of that. So, like all of the science kids, they go, they study chemistry, they study biology, maybe eventually they go to med school or they work in like pharmaceuticals or
Mm.
whatever. And all the math kids, or like they take a turn and do computer science once those courses are available to them, and that's what they do in college. And I had this sense of like, I don't know, I guess I could do a lot of different things, but the only thing I actually like doing is music, and it's the only thing that I don't currently have access to in a
Yeah.
school setting. And I was really grappling with this sense of like, even though I was doing a lot of music, feeling like I needed to be taught music.
Mm.
And I felt this both from like a theoretical perspective, like even though I'm writing pieces, I don't understand like the harmonic progression chart. I think three different people had tried to explain to me when I was in high school. And I was like, nope, like water over the brain. But then even with piano, that was another big thing, was recognizing that even though I played guitar and played piano, I didn't have classical training. And so I couldn't pursue performance, which in my like brain at the time was the only way that you pursued music. Like I
Mm.
didn't understand what music tech was. I didn't understand what I eventually understood what composition was. Certainly didn't understand the more academic versions of music theory or musicology. And so as I was getting to the end of high school, I started thinking, I think I want to do music, but I know I am not currently good enough to get into a program that's like a Juilliard or a conservatory
Yeah.
style program. So I really I need to find somewhere that has a robust music program that doesn't require that I already know how to get
Yeah.
into it. And basically what I came up with was like, well, I can't be a performer, but maybe I could be a composer. I basically started doing composition as a way to keep doing music
Mm.
because I knew that I couldn't do the other routes. So yeah, as I was leaving high school, like that scholars program I mentioned, we had to do actually like a senior thesis in high school, and I wrote a short story for it that was sort of like a, I don't know, like dorky teenage dystopian like Hunger Games esque
Mm.
short story. But then I wrote three pieces that were meant to be sort of a soundtrack for the story. And they were just with like Sibelius built in sounds and certainly it was probably writing things out of range and like
Yeah.
really like that, like no sense of orchestration, whether or not that stopped me. So then I was applying to schools. I really wanted to go to like a liberal arts school because I liked the idea of being able to do other things besides music. So I applied to a handful of liberal arts schools that it seemed like they had good music programs, or at least they had an environment where I could maybe do that. And I wound up at the College of Worcester in Northeast Ohio, which wound up being perfect because it's one of the only liberal arts schools that actually offers a bachelor's of music. So I was able to like do a fully fledged composition degree, but I didn't have to audition. Like I auditioned for Oberlin with my portfolio of like
Yeah.
handbell pieces and a piano piece and didn't get in. And I kind of knew that that was going to happen. And Worcester wound up being the place where I could just enter and start.
Yeah. I think it's interesting hearing you talk about how like you knew you just needed to learn more. And that's something I can relate to because I started my undergraduate studies at a state school in Kentucky as a music ed
Mhm.
major. It was the school to go to if Morehead State University, the school to go to if you were going to teach, like be a band director, right?
Right, right,
After you graduated. And I quickly realized I loved being in band. I loved marching band at the time, but I, I quickly lost sight of like the vision of me doing that as a career,
yeah,
but there was no composition program. And so I just like would spend a lot of time in the library. I kind of had to figure out like, okay, well, how can I get from like point A to point B now with the resources I have? And that ended up being like, okay, I need to get into a grad school. Well, I don't even know what that looks like,
right,
but I knew I had to do it. And then, yeah, I kind of just applied to a few places and ended up going to University of South Florida to get my degree. And it was like the perfect place for somebody who didn't know like what they were doing at that time. I think it
right,
quickly changed. Like the program
okay.
was evolving into like a more prestigious kind of thing.
So something that it's not a struggle, it's just a realization, is like, where I went to high school in the same neighborhood that Carnegie Mellon and Pitt are in
Yeah.
Pittsburgh. And so my perception of a school that was a more like large scale institution was like basically just those two schools. And I
Right.
didn't want to go there. Like I wanted to go somewhere that was small. I didn't want to be taught but in a 400-person lecture class. But the problem with that is then my perception of like I had zero perception of what music programs looked like
Mm.
at all. And it was great that I wound up at Worcester. But then when I went to Louisville for my master's and I was looking at these undergrads in the music program, I was like, oh, I could have gone somewhere like this too.
Yeah.
Like, why did I
Exactly.
like how did I miss that? And obviously it's worked out fine. I certainly don't regret my time at Worcester. It was incredible. But yeah, I'm curious, like, have you had similar experiences looking back where you're like, why did I go there? Or like, why did I think that this was what I had to do?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, at the time, like when I left high school, I was composing. I knew that that was a part of what I wanted to do, but of course, like the financially secure path would have been being something like a band director. That was like 15 years ago. That might be
Right.
different now. I
Right.
think that's very different now.
Right.
But yeah, I think it was just like I'm a first generation college student, so neither of my parents like really knew. I mean, they supported me, but they didn't know like the ins and outs of academia, certainly.
Of
And
course.
so it was kind of like, okay, I'll go to the school that's half an hour away, has a great music program. And then once I was there, I had to kind of figure it out. But I wouldn't say I look back and like wish I had gone somewhere different. Again, like you
Yeah.
just kind of alluded to, like it all worked out for me too.
Right.
But yeah, when I was at USF as a grad student, I you know, for example, my wife was a senior. Susanna was a senior when I started grad school at USF, and she taught me a lot of stuff, so
Right.
there were like undergrads teaching me like stuff about like notation, stuff about like aesthetic ideas or
Right.
how to I remember one time I was talking to her about electroacoustic music, which is something I'd never done before. I mean, we were
Yeah.
just hanging out And I was like, I don't get it. Like I'm taking these classes. It's part of the degree. I'm having a hard time like wrapping my head around it. And she was like, there's just something liberating about not having bar lines. That's what I like about it.
Yeah,
And just her saying that, she was again, I mean, we're just a year apart, but
right.
she was an undergrad, and she said that to me, and I was like,
Oh,
"Oh,
that's
oh
it.
man." Yeah, and then it
I
changed.
I need to send out a survey to like how many composers who do electronics was that like the hook, because that
Yeah.
is exactly what I felt too. Like when I was we didn't have they we had sort of like a more popular music oriented electronics course, and it was a half credit course. It was like
Yeah.
we really didn't have electronics in my undergrad. And I did an independent study with my advisor in my last semester that was just on electronics. And I mean, it was very helpful. I kind of had to relearn things iteratively over the following years. But that came up for me too, is like the piece I wrote, I don't even remember what DAW I used. I think it was Digital Performer, but
Mm,
composing things in just a purely temporal, like
yeah.
I'm not looking at a bar count, I'm looking at time. Yeah, it had a huge impact on how that was like the last thing I did as an undergrad. And then I think it had a huge impact on my mentality moving into grad school.
I'm just wondering out of my own curiosity, actually, because I'm from Kentucky. I'm pretty familiar with a lot of those programs, but I admit that I'm not too familiar with the program at Louisville. What did that look like in your master's? I mean,
Yeah.
was it kind of like my USF experience where you were looking at undergrads like, you know
Well, it's so interesting the ways that different programs emphasize different things without realizing they're doing it. So, as an undergrad, I mean, I went through the full like music theory, music history curriculum.
Yeah.
My undergrad comp professor was a man named Jack Gallagher, and he really brought me from 0 to 60 in terms of knowing how to compose. My first lessons with him were just like make melodies based on these different shapes, or
Mm,
like we're going to start with a piano piece because that's your instrument. But he also taught a class on living composers. It was one of the upper class seminars, and that was basically the way that anyone learned about living music or
mm,
contemporary music. But the the type of music that he shared in that class was definitely of a certain generation, and he wrote
yeah.
very like beautiful like orchestral romantic style music, like incredible orchestrator. Just certainly of that kind of tradition. And so in this class, it's where he introduced me to people like Arvo Pärt and
Mm,
Steve Reich and Boulez. And so some of the like big name pillars of contemporary music. But also in that class was like James McMillan, Tristan Murray, Kalehiaho, like Joseph Schwantner. There were these pieces that like I wound up having a really solid repertoire foundation as I went into grad school. And I had a solid training foundation as I went into grad school. I think the draw for Louisville for me, one was practical. So Louisville doesn't have PhD students,
mm,
and for many years, I don't know if it's currently still there. I think it might be on pause. They had a fully funded fellowship called the Baumard Fellowship for two incoming composers as master's students. And so, first and foremost, it of the programs I got into, it was the one that I didn't have to pay for. And
yeah.
I had to take a lot of loans out as an undergrad. So I had this like, I can't do that anymore. If I want to keep doing this, someone has to pay me to do it. So there was that really big practical element. But Louisville also hosts the Grawemeyer Award,
Yeah, right.
which is, if you're not familiar with it, the Grawemeyer Award is one of the most, I mean, it's one of the most significant composition awards in the world. Like people internationally win this award. It is talked about internationally. the people who have won it, like the first person who won it was Ludoslavsky.
Mm.
The second person was Ligeti. When I was there, Andrew Norman and Bent Sorensen won it. But what that means is that the culture at Louisville is so new music. They're so aware of what's going on in the world because people are sending their scores from all over the world every year to enter
Yeah.
the Grawemeyer Award. And that trickles through the whole faculty. It wasn't just the comp area. So in the comp area, I mean, we were being introduced to really like the newest of new stuff because we were getting it in the library. But even, the student orchestra, and Louisville is just, I mean, it's a great school, but it's sort of just another university in Kentucky, right? So certainly, like you said, a lot of the undergrads were coming in from high school being like,
Right.
yeah, I want to be a band director, or I want to be an orchestra director. And then they were getting into band and playing like new music, or they were getting into
Yeah.
orchestra and playing new music. Like I think, and they also, the school had a new music festival every year, and they'd have a guest composer every year. And before I was there, Brett Dean came and he played the solo for his viola concerto with the orchestra, the
Mm.
student orchestra. And my director, when I was there, she was like, we had absolutely no business playing that piece. That was so far above our pay grade. But he elevated the students to the level where they could play that piece. And so I just think as a program, it was really, I found it very receptive as a composer. I could ask my classmates to play my music and they were game. I was getting exposure to so much different music. And I also had a really terrific cohort. I was there at the same time as my colleague Cullen Murphy, and then a
Mm.
year below us, Derek Carter. And the three of us being there together, I think, had a huge impact on me just because, again, like sort of like you were saying with Susanna, being able to bring our experiences together and share it with one another and hash out what we were working on. And eventually we created a little performance trio. So it was just, I found it very fulfilling, and it cultivated a lot of the interests and skills I have now.
Yeah, I have to also give a shout out to my grad cohort at USF because it was very much that kind of relationship with the three of us. There was a composer, Jeremy Adams, ahead of me, and then the year that I came in, Vincent Giuliano was the composer. I'm not actually sure either of them are composing much anymore. I'm sad to say because they were both great composers.
Right.
But our teacher Baljinder Sekon, rather than having one-on-one lessons, we would do group lessons as grad students.
Oh,
And
that's
so
fascinating.
and
That's
so there
super
there I
interesting.
was, like, I didn't know anything, and then I got to be in lessons with these two other composers who knew a bunch of different stuff. They wrote in different aesthetics. Vinny, he had he was a rare exception that he went through the undergrad program there and was admitted as a grad student. That was something they didn't really do often
Hmm.
with students. So Vinny came in with all of that knowledge, and he's like trying to coach me on like modular synthesis and all that kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
it was just a really great way to like go through grad school. I think
Yeah. It's
that cross
so
pollination.
It's so critical, and I was so lucky that it happened to me because as soon as I got there, I was like, "Oh my god, this could have been bad." Like, if I wasn't here with people that I really
Yeah.
vibed with, this could have been a really frustrating experience. But yeah, I mean, Cullen sort of introduced me to new discipline composition, like Jennifer Walsh, Jesse Marino, and he was and remains very interested in that. But then one of the first conversations I had with Carter was we were both listening to this new Steve Lehman record, which is this like Steve Lehman is this composer who's also a jazz saxophonist. So he writes this music that's sort of spectral jazz, and he had just released this collaborative record with a Senegalese rapper, and we were obsessed with it. And so having these sort of points of
Mhm.
musical interests, and we were all listening to a lot of stuff and bringing it and asking each other about it. Yeah, it was really important.
So I think I want to keep moving through your timeline here because my next question I'm pretty sure will open up our conversation more into your process and the work that you do nowadays. But after Louisville, you spent some time in Ireland pursuing a degree in experimental sound practice from University College Cork
Yes.
in Cork. What led you there, and what was that experience like?
I think like you mentioned briefly earlier that in the back of your head at some point was this sense of practically what should I pursue? And for me that was actually orchestral conducting. And so while I was at Louisville, I was doing a lot of conducting as well as composing, and I had this idea that I wanted to do a conducting degree after Louisville to sort
Hmm.
of give myself that professional, like, I need things besides just being a composer, and I'm
Yeah,
still not a good performer. So maybe, but I loved conducting. And so I was looking at competitive international scholarship programs like Fulbright, and I was applying for Fulbright, and I applied through Fulbright to a program in England that was all like contemporary conducting. And Louisville had a really robust office of competitive fellowships. So they were basically there to help students apply for these competitive
yeah,
scholarships. And one of the other things about my background is my mom's parents were from Ireland. And when I was an undergrad, I did a 1 month program in Belfast on conflict studies, like completely unrelated. I was also an English major as an undergrad, and I did my thesis on Ulysses by James Joyce. So I was really interested in my Irish background. I still had family in Ireland. I had met them. And this all came up as I was talking about Fulbright with this woman who led the office. And she was like, you know, I know you want to do Fulbright, but have you heard of the Mitchell Scholarship? I was like, no, what's that? And basically, the Mitchell Scholarship is this competitive fellowship for American undergrads to go and do a master's degree in Ireland. And she said, I know you have this idea about this particular program. You should see if there's something you can do in Ireland that's the same. And so I was sort of shopping around for things in Ireland with the idea of finding something so that I could apply for the scholarship and go. And I wound up connecting with John Godfrey, who's at the time was head of the department at UCC. And I was telling him about my ideas. And he basically said, like, he was very receptive to the ideas, but he was like, look, this isn't a conservatory, but you can certainly put something together if you want to. So like you could do a performance degree where you're putting an ensemble together and like being part of the scene in Cork. I was like, oh, cool. That would be really interesting, actually. I got the scholarship. I let him know that I got it, and he was like, great. By the way, yesterday we just got this new degree approved, and I think you should do that
wow,
instead.
that's amazing.
Yeah. And it was like, oh, cool. And the scholarship was okay with it, and I was like, this actually looks really interesting, like, and I think there would be ways for me to pursue what I want to pursue anyway, even if I do this degree. And so when the time came, I graduated from Louisville, and then I went to Ireland and I enrolled in that experimental sound practice degree instead. Basically, the motivation of the program was recognizing that there are so many different facets of sonic art that don't require or whose practitioners don't have training in Western classical experience, which is obviously the maybe besides jazz and maybe besides some music tech, it's like the way that you study music in higher ed.
Right.
And so the coursework for the degree was based on just like what are these practices outside of that are sort of on the fringes of music and of different artistic practices or artistic communities. And so the coursework included like lots of improvisation, lots of digital media and electronics. We had a whole course called Expanded Instrument Systems, which is based on Pauline Oliveros's Expanded Instrument
Mm.
System. Field recording, sound art. We had sort of the more theoretical side was we had a sound studies class, which was all about just sort of scholarship involved with sound. And yeah, I mean, it was totally transformative. Like, I think if Louisville, thinking, Worcester to Louisville, if Louisville was a real expansion and pulling me from what I learned at Worcester into very now practices of contemporary classical music, Cork was like, okay, great. Here's everything else.
Yeah.
um, and I realized that, like, I loved everything else, and that even I had so much terrific experience and real fondness for the classical tradition by the time I got to Cork. But in a lot of ways, I was still grappling with this sort of imposter syndrome sense of, like, I'm still bad at sight singing, or like I still
Mm,
can't play piano. And even when you're a composer, my sense has always been like, people kind of expect you to have some of those musical skills that you're not actually spending a ton of time cultivating, and a lot of composers have them. And I
yeah.
had this sense of like, I just don't, or I don't feel like I do. Or if I do, it takes me a lot of time and energy to build those skills back up. And it's not how I want to spend my time. And then I got to Cork and we were doing all of this work. And I was like, oh my gosh, I actually have been building musical
Mm,
skills, but it's all these things about like sensitivity to listening or sensitivity to gesture and texture, or like thinking about space or thinking about more holistic experiences. And I just had never tapped into it because that wasn't the focus of coursework
right.
previously. So I really just wound up running with most of the practices that we learned about in Cork because they resonated so strongly with me and with my, I guess, my sense of musical and artistic priorities and sonic priorities. And yeah, it was a 1 year program. And like that year, there's before I was in Cork and
Mm.
after I was in Cork in terms of what I do as a creator.
Yeah, you're talking about how, I guess, philosophically you had been kind of cultivating these things that you ended up kind of expanding upon in Cork. Had you practically done any of this stuff? Had you done, like, free improv before?
No,
Had you worked heavily in, like, the electroacoustic space prior to your time
no,
there? Yeah.
almost not at all. I mean, we actually had a really robust electronic music area at Louisville, and the professor who does electronics there, Christoph Folek, is like really terrific. But I took the sort of year-long sequence where we learned Max MSP
Mm,
and then did not. And I was just like,
yeah,
okay. And in honesty, what I did instead was I focused on conducting, right?
yeah.
Like, I think some people went back to the electronics and I went more towards the conducting, which was terrific. And I don't regret that at all. I had a terrific time doing that. So when I got to Cork, I had used Max MSP before. I had used DAWs a little bit. Like, I was still pretty bad at using a DAW. So I knew enough to be situated, but not any of the practical knowledge almost at all. I hadn't done any free improv. I also, something that became really important was I hadn't done any extended vocal stuff.
Mm,
And I'd always been interested in that, even like going back to when I was a kid, like listening to screamo, like a genre based around
yeah, sure.
someone doing extended vocal technique. And certainly I was really interested in composers who were doing pieces like that. And I was in this sort of performance new discipline trio at Louisville. But one of the things I did in Cork was the head of the theater department was his background was like operatic voice and composition, and he sort of moved sideways into theater. And I took a class with him called Cultures of Voicing that was actually for theater students, and it was all about how to use your body to explore different vocal
Mm,
techniques and different timbres. And for their purposes, to the end of like adopting different characters or
right.
doing voice acting, or even just sort of diversifying their range as a performer. But for me, it was like permission to do a bunch of vocal techniques that I was still hesitant to do because, I sang in choir when I was at Worcester and Louisville, when you're in any vocal context that's related to Western classical music, it's like you will either sing this the right way or you will die.
It's
And
very pure
yeah, and
sound.
not
Yeah.
in the sense of like you will die because I will kill you. You will die because your throat will explode, right?
Yeah.
Like it's,
Right.
and and then I was like watching these undergrads in Cork doing these incredible sounds with their voice. And I was like, oh, you just have to like do it. Like,
Yeah.
like having a little bit of scaffolding about breathing technique and feeling your body and making sure that you're not straining, but then you can just like go. You can just do this. And that was really liberating for me. So, yeah, pretty much down the line, if you look at the coursework from that degree in Cork, it was like, oh, that's where James started doing that. And that's where James started doing that. And that's where James started doing that.
You're doing a good job of selling this program, because even I'm sitting here like, maybe I should do this.
I have sold it to people, and
Yeah.
people have gone because I've told them to do it. I think there are programs that maybe could be like this in the States. Like, I think what Cal Arts does is perhaps similar to what they do
Mm,
in Cork. But I mean, in terms of my trajectory, it was such happenstance that I wound up at Cork at all. And it was such happenstance that this program got approved the year that I went.
yeah.
And while I was there, I found out later that there was more of a traditional conservatory style school in Cork. And the first semester I was there, I took more conducting lessons because I still had this idea in my mind. And like it was fine, but I had this sense of like, thank God I did not do another year of conducting because this is just like I did this already. Like I wouldn't have grown at all if this is where I
Yeah.
had wound up. And at UCC, I grew in ways I just didn't even know existed.
And as the threads unravel, Suzanne and I spent some time in Cork last summer, and we'll be going back
Right.
this summer actually. But because you saw that I was in Ireland and going to Cork, you recommended Maureen's. I got to give a shout out to Maureen's Pub, because that became our favorite pub in the world.
Yep.
And you weren't the only person that recommended it, but you were the first. And so I'd like to think that
Nice.
all of this journey that you're describing led me to Maureen's, where we almost
Totally.
met Killian. We almost encountered Killian Murphy there, but we were late. So you almost could have taken credit for that too. So
Well, I'll take credit for the almost.
so I'm always interested to talk with people about free improvisation kind of
Mhm.
stuff, because that is such its own universe, really, its own galaxy of practices and methods and all that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering if you could just kind of talk for a little bit and describe how you approach free improvisation in your creative work, maybe how it started at UCC and how it's maybe evolved since then.
So improvising was a big part of the curriculum at UCC. It was one of the few things that we did for the whole year. Like we had one course, but we did it both semesters. And there's so many different approaches to improvisation in general, right? And every genre in a way has its tradition of improvisation, including classical music, right? Like there's such a healthy tradition, or there
Right.
was such a healthy tradition of improvisation. Perhaps what many people think of now is more of a like free jazz or jazz adjacent improv. This was a real like gesture, texture, what is this sound, like sort of American experimentalism approach to improvisation. It was almost more like creating like live and not ambient music, because ambient music is its own thing, but live sort of spatialized soundscapey texture musical events. And I mean, there were a lot of things that came of this. One of my challenges was that when we first started, like we would go to class and basically get set up and start improvising. And one of my first challenges was like I realized I was improvising in a way that was like I was composing.
Mm.
And my cohort was there was a jazz trumpet player, there was a filmmaker who also played drums and bass for like death metal bands, and
Oh,
there was
yeah.
a theater sound designer. That was my cohort. And so I would do something, and obviously none of them would do anything remotely close to what
Yeah.
a composition might do with that material. And so I very quickly had to divorce myself from the idea that this is how material can or should be developed. The other thing that was amazing at Cork was that, I guess I misspoke a little bit earlier in that I had encountered improvisation before, but often when I had encountered it, like at a summer festival, the person facilitating the workshop often retreated back into that, like, it's hard to teach improvisation, like,
Yeah.
and that, like, I call bullshit on that actually, because the the professors at Cork taught us improvisation. Like, we did exercises about how to expand your listening and how to
Mm.
be more aware or how to be more responsive. And they were designed like in a similar way that you might do exercises to improve your technical facility on an instrument. They're really designed to improve your reactive and responsive and listening facility in the moment of improvising. And perhaps most profoundly, there was a big scene of experimental music and experimental art in general, just like fringe art stuff in Cork. And I remember going to an improv set in my first months there and just thinking like, this is like some of the best music I've ever heard in my life. Like, this is so engaging and so interesting. Why do I have a hold up about the fact that, like, it's not working in the same way as the music I've been trained to make is?
Yeah.
And so that was a really profound moment of, like, just expanding what could be possible. The other thing that came up for me in studying improv like this and doing improv was that as I increasingly did vocal improv, I realized that the way that you can navigate into different sounds or different textures or different relationships is very felt. It's less strategic than what we might think of vocalization as, like, being really, like, locked in with harmony, or listening to sort of jazz vocalists who can freely modulate through
Right.
7 keys, and I cannot do that, and it's extraordinary. But in the improv we were doing, I was like, it's actually more productive for me to just feel and explore what's happening in my body, register the sonic output, and then use that as material. So not only did that become a really, like, cogent philosophy in my improvising, but it became a huge part of my composition. Like, I started going back to the music I was writing and realizing, if I'm approaching improv this way, I bet, of course, like, every musician, every performer must be approaching their instrument in a similar way. Like, there must
Mm.
be some sort of felt interstice of, like, and usually it's what you're trying to avoid in many classical music styles, but there are these spaces that you can actually navigate to through your body, and that produce all sorts of fascinating
Yeah.
results. And so the improvising wound up affecting my music in such a way that I started trying to write pieces and make scores that were trying to get performers into that space. And then once they were there, let them cultivate the things they might find there, rather than being really didactic about timing
Yeah.
or, like, when should you move from sol tasto to sol
Right.
ponticello.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that actually, how this manifests in your composed work, because you have a number of scores that feature various degrees of non-traditional elements like graphic notation or text-based instructions. I'm thinking of pieces like your dredge pieces, and there's another one for percussion that you have that's just a beautiful score.
Oh, thank you.
It's called, please correct me if I'm saying this wrong, anthropony.
Yeah, anthrophony.
Anthropony. So I'm guessing now that these practices were kind of born out of your time in Cork as well. How do you approach this from a composer's standpoint in your scores, and what has the response been like from performers? Are
Yeah.
they keen to kind of journey with you into this space?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So I mean, in some ways it started from a practical standpoint. Like while I was in Cork, I was writing a piece for a trio called Trompo. They're based in the Netherlands. And I had started by actually recording an improvisation, and I was sort of doing a light transcription to make this piece. And it was like really overly notated, like lots of like time changes and specificity there. And they basically said, "Look, we're spending so much time trying to coordinate this that we're not actually playing your music." And so being in the program, I was like, "Okay, what is a better way to achieve this?" And that's where I started sort of moving away from a typical score and moving into like, how can I still use notation to communicate to people who are from the tradition of notation, but encourage them to either be a little bit more free or kind of help remove some of the rehearsal barriers that come up with complicated new music so that they can get to the sounds faster.
Mm.
And then once I did that, and that one wound up looking like a kind of typical duration based score. But then I wrote Anthrophony after that, and the idea there was, okay, well, why can't I take it further? Like, what if I'm going after a gesture or a texture that's really not super grounded in like specific metrical time? Why do I need to use time at all?
Yeah, right.
Um, and I think something that I encountered through studying improvisation is obviously there's this incredible tradition of graphic scores, but I wanted to have something that was a little bit more repeatable than a graphic score, because you could give a graphic score to 7 different people from 7 different traditions, and you're going to get 7 different,
Right.
completely different like results. And I had this sense of, I like this idea of freedom, but I still want to be clear in the kind of sound world I'm cultivating. And that's kind of been the main motivator for the pieces like Anthrophony and like the Dredge pieces. Like the Dredge pieces, what I'm doing there, and if you're curious, they're on my website and you can see them, is there's actually a lot of very specific notation, but it is arranged in such a way that it's like, I'm using this notation because I know, as someone in contemporary classical music, you will look at this and know the sounds I'm asking about.
Mm.
Like if I put in a bunch of nested tuplets and half harmonic fingering and whatever, you know, like you have an idea of what that means. But I don't care if you actually play what I wrote. I want you to play that sound world.
Mm.
And once you're in that sound world, I want you to explore it. So I think with purely graphic notation, you run the risk of basically like losing a little bit of, how to even say it. I guess like depending on your comfort level, it can be really close to what you imagined or it can be super far away. And I wanted to still encourage a sense of freedom and exploration, but for performers who maybe have not done improvisation before and still within a particular sonic environment that I'm
Mm.
interested in.
Yeah, I think going through this path, of composition myself and encountering all kinds of different people and opinions and aesthetics, I feel like there's always this kind of underlying assumption from certain schools of thought that, graphic notation is almost like a cop out for composers,
Right.
And I love what you're saying about taking the graphic notation to a different level where your voice is still there.
Right.
It's not just like, here's a picture, make stuff up.
Right.
It's like you still have this very thought out process behind it. You have these results that you're looking for, but like you said, the freedom. I really love that.
You know, the other thing that my scores look like is sort of Lutoslawski aleatory, and that's another thing that I don't like, because I think aleatory has become, sorry, let me rephrase that. I like aleatory. I don't always love how it's implemented in
Yeah.
contemporary music. And Not because I don't think it's well thought out, but because I think it becomes very rote. Like it can become rote for the performer, and it can, to my hearing, distance the performer from what's going on in the performance because they're just locked into doing something repeatedly rather than really thinking about, okay, what is the space that's being created? What is the timing of it? What's the gesture? So something I write in my scores is like, do not play what I have written. Figure out what sound world this is and locate yourself in it.
You gave an example with this trio of how you were first writing this kind of music, and it was extremely notated, to almost, it sounded like to a fault, where
Yeah,
they were like, this is so complicated, we're not able to make music out of this, we're not
right.
able to make art out of this. What has been the response from performers now that you have opened things up, made things more free for them?
It varies. It definitely requires some communication, right? Because there's still this expectation of, are we executing what you're putting on the page, quote unquote, correctly?
Yeah.
And I think just what correctly means shifts in this context. So the percussion piece I actually wrote as a commission for Western Carolina University's percussion studio, which Adam Groh
Mm,
runs slash ran. I think
yeah.
he's moving to Cincinnati.
Yeah, we're excited.
Yeah.
We love Adam. So,
Um,
yeah.
but so that has actually become one of my most performed pieces because I've gotten it into the hands of a few university percussion instructors. And the instructors love it because it is a nice way to introduce things like improvisation or more free form scores without being just a totally open graphic score.
Yeah.
But I've also been lucky enough to work with a lot of the student ensembles who have done it. And I think that has been extremely rewarding for myself certainly, but also based on feedback for the students, because I think with my slightly more strategic approach to improvisation, I'm able to ask them to do things or to come up with exercises about how to pull apart the score a bit that really opens their ears to the ways that they can engage with what
Mm.
I'm giving. So where I have a rehearsal tonight for the premiere of Dredge 1, and it'll be interesting to see how this works because this one, I wrote it for the group that I'm a part of in New Orleans called Versipel, but I also wrote it so that free improvisers who like I play with in gigs around the city can just sit in and add.
Mm.
So there's no part for them. They're kind of supplementing and augmenting as though it's an actual live free improv. And I'm really excited about this because I think that this is sort of the pinnacle is like, how can I create something that still lets people explore and not just explore in general, but one of the things that happens is in free improv is like suddenly material will stick out and I'm
Mm.
like, "Oh, I have to pursue that. I That was not the plan, but here we are and
Yeah.
now I have to go this way." And that even in the realm of like open notation that I'm using, that is still a challenge. Like, how do you let someone really find a path and follow it? And I'm hoping that this piece gets closer to that. I think one thing that I haven't actually heard this from a performer, but something I've been thinking about is complexity and
Mm.
how with contemporary classical music, we tend to think of complexity in terms of like microtonality or like heavy rhythmic
You're
notation,
right.
like of the like Fernie-Ho-esque complexity. And I think one of the misperceptions about that type of complexity is that it is totally restrictive. I think Fernie-Ho himself, like he's writing those things on purpose, but there's also a lot of philosophy behind like pushing performers into a space where they have to make a negotiation
Yeah.
and what comes out of that. And so in my scores, I'm thinking of complexity less in terms of notation and more in terms of character and like what are the things that I can put in the score that allow the performer to continually uncover new ideas and new sounds. And sometimes that's notation, sometimes it's graphics, oftentimes it's text, and like being very purposeful about the way that I write instructions in the score and the way that I load the score with text. It's not there because I'm trying to be overly controlling of technique. It's there as another way that the performer can look at the score and dig into what the score means. And I hope that that is what something like this pulls up. Now, obviously, the challenge with this is that if you're working with folks who are trained in contemporary classical music, they're trained to be very good at
Mm.
getting to a score, figuring out what to do, and getting out quickly. And it just requires a different type of engagement. And I don't always know if that is clear. But I've been really lucky to basically work closely with the people performing these so I can explain it to some degree.
You bringing up Fernio kind of this kind of idea clicked for me, and you can please correct me if I'm wrong, but the things that you do in your music, it's almost like trying to undo our training as classical musicians, which is
Yeah.
something that's a really attractive idea to me.
Yeah, well, and I think it was an attractive idea to me coming out of Cork because I was witnessing all of these other practices that just
Yeah.
had nothing to do with Western classical music. I think, like, obviously, as an institution, plenty of problems to address here, but there is still something that's very useful about having the institution of like ensembles
Mm.
and classical music as a way to present this kind of work. The challenge is then how do you pull people away from that? You know, I feel like to a degree, you just have to collaborate. Like you have to be in the room together. You have to all buy into this idea. I think some of the classical ensembles who have done this well are ensembles where they've sort of gone in heads down and workshopped with the composer. Like I'm thinking of Talk Ensemble has
Mm.
this CD with Brandon Lopez. I think it's called like Church Table of Plenty or something like that. But it's like totally improvised, but it was a piece that was devised with the composer.
Yeah.
And that also to me is very exciting. I think one of the other at the time inspirations for doing this was sort of feeling a bit queasy about the sort of hierarchical power relationship between composer, performer,
Yeah.
conductor, ensemble, like who gets credit for what. But now on the flip side, it's like, is it any more ethical to force an ensemble to do a bunch of stuff that they are not trained to do?
Right.
You know, so how can I cultivate something where no one feels like they're at fault or they're not getting it, but that truly is just encouraging them to listen more deeply, engage with each other in new ways, and hopefully create some really interesting sounds at the end.
Yeah. So I noticed recently that you posted about doing some field recording work in what looked like a swamp or a
Yes.
bayou, maybe. And you mentioned earlier that that was something that you encountered at UCC in Cork. What role does field recording play in your creative process and in your work in general?
One of the things that I was introduced to when I was at Cork was this sort of world of soundscape composition, which I think most people associate the term soundscape with R. Murray Schafer. And what folks might not be aware of is that sort of following a lot of his writing and a lot of his work was this robust tradition of electronic music that used field recordings not as just sonic material, but as a way to actually evoke a sense of place. And so the practitioner who I most often look up to in this regard is Hildegard Westerkamp. And so field recording, when it was introduced to me, there's a big technical element to field recording. You sort of learn about how the recorders work and how the microphones work. And if you want to record this, you should think about this microphone. But the much more significant thing for me was this new way of listening and this awareness of your sonic environment. And field recording as a way to be more in tune with the variation in sound in our world. One of the experiences I have often with field recording is if I'm recording something, I don't want to stop, because it's like once you actually key into how much activity there is in everyday life, it's like everything is very special and
Mm.
every moment is very unique. And I think there, in some ways, that reflects this sort of improvisation idea that I'm pulling out in that side of my work, which is that, we don't need to be precious about like repeating material or having like recognizable melodies or like recognizable patterns in the music. You can just have these naturally occurring rhythms and gestures that aren't quite locked in metrically, but have some sense of ebb and flow and familiarity, but continual growth. And I think that just doing field recording has really cultivated my awareness of sound in that way. More directly, I guess, trying to use field recordings in my music. So I have a piece called Thin Places, which is basically, it's an improvisation piece, but and there is a graphic score, but the more important score is an aural score. So I made a fixed media track out of field recordings that I had
Mm.
taken, and the idea was that the performers would improvise along to that playback. And I just really love, I mean, literally the sound worlds. Like, I find them very fascinating as a listener. I find them very engaging as a listener. I find them very evocative. So if they're incorporated into performance contexts, they can be really powerful. And thinking about complexity and where do we get complexity from in music, I think that the suggestions of a field recording create very complex responses and like complex affects. So hearing a bird call in a forest, like it pulls up things about like, have you heard this bird before? What kind of forest do you
Mm.
think this is in? I have a recording that I play for my students, and it's of these basically like frogs and bugs in the woods at night in Ohio, and it was after a day of rain. But I don't tell them any of that. I ask them like, "Okay, what are you hearing?" And they say, "Okay, well, there are frogs, there are bugs. It sounds like rain, whatever." But then from there, I ask them, "Okay, what time of day do you think this recording was taken?"
Mm.
And every time, everyone says, "Oh, it was at night." And I say, "Okay, how do you know that? I didn't tell you that." And then they realize like, "Oh, it's because you only hear frogs and bugs like that at night."
Yeah.
And so that kind of, like, that is for me another type of complexity, is your relationship to sounds and what they signify to you. And that kind of complexity is what soundscape composition really leverages and manipulates. And I find it equally fascinating. So the field recording has been a way for me to explore that. In some ways, it's just a way for me to be doing something. Like, even if I haven't used a recording in a piece, it's just a nice practice to go out and very purposefully spend time doing field recording
Yeah.
and thinking about, what is this sound? How can I make a recording that captures it? What do I learn about the recording when I listen back to it versus just being there? It's almost become like just a hobby and activity, but it comes from that place of sort of aesthetic and complex sonic interest.
Yeah. What comes to mind is I'm really into like a bunch of Japanese media, whether that be like movies or TV,
Hmm.
I guess live action stuff, for lack of a better word, or even anime, and how they always use like cicada sounds to signify that it's summertime. They never,
Right.
they never explicitly say it's summertime in Japan. It's just like you just hear the drone of cicadas in the background of whatever it is, whatever the scene is.
Right.
And I think that's, I've never been there, but I've just picked up on that. And I think it's interesting how, whether we know it or not, like like your students knew that it was nighttime because of the frogs. And
Right.
it's kind of interesting how like that just gets ingrained into our, like, I guess, instinct, really.
Yeah. And I think what the composers who do this were really there were some sort of humanities based research motivations for doing this. Like I think the first soundscape piece properly was they were recording a bunch of sounds of Vancouver and the harbor, and they wanted to create a piece for the radio that communicated the sense of being on a ship and entering the harbor.
Yeah.
And what they realized is, well, we could just record like being on a boat and doing that, but it would take 2 hours. And instead, how can we edit this to get the sense of moving from the water to the land and passing significant sonic markings like foghorns or the way that waves change when you get closer to shore, or the way that a city becomes more present.
Mm.
And so you have to start editing things. You have to start cutting up recordings. You have to condense things. And once you make an edit, you're making a creative decision.
Yeah.
And so then soundscape composition is basically like taking that moment of edit. And many field recordists also argue, and I would agree, that the creative decision making starts when you pick what you're using to record with. But acknowledging that these are decisions you have to make, and they can be aesthetic decisions, I think is the basis for this kind of knowledge.
While we're talking about the outdoors, I'm really interested in hearing about your project, Bayou La Terre. I mean, you have a really beautiful, I guess, it's almost like a trailer video on your
Yeah.
website where it kind of digs into the environment that you're in, a little bit about this collaboration. It shows you guys pit firing ceramic rattles, which is
Yes.
something that's really interesting to me. Can you talk about this collaboration and project and what it's meant for your creative thinking?
So after I left Ireland, I moved to New Orleans because my wife is doing her PhD at Tulane. And I got put in touch with a studio artist, Kat Gamble, who's from New Orleans, who had actually also studied in Cork in a different program, but we wound up in like the same circle of friends,
Mm,
but displaced by time. So I was in communication with Kat, and she reached out to me eventually because she's very interested in place and in sort of the relationship between a person or a people and the land they live on, in issues of like domesticity. And she had this idea about like land and the tools that we make from the land, and how certain processes help like build our identities around where we are or who we are. And so she came to me with this project idea of basically like, I want to make rattles, I want to pit fire them, and then I want to have some sort of sonic element since we're making rattles. So is this like, does this resonate with you? Can you think of anything? And so what I wound up doing was making this like text piece, this sort of like Pauline Oliveros text piece exercise for the participants to use the rattles and try to use the rattles to mimic what they're hearing in the land we were on. And obviously the joke there is you can't, like, you have a
yeah.
rattle and that is a frog. but
Right.
but like it can start to cultivate a sense of, okay, what are the patterns I'm hearing in the frog, what are the patterns I'm hearing in the rattle, what are the ways that I can manipulate this rattle to get towards what I'm hearing. And when Kat led her part of the workshop, which was doing making the rattles, she was talking a lot about sort of working with clay and sort of, if I was talking about Pauline Oliveros and listening, she was talking about a sort of studio art into interdisciplinary art equivalent of artist thinkers who have postulated ideas about what it means to work with this material. So, I mean, in terms of what it's meant for my career, so to speak, or at least my music making, I think one of the things that I experienced in Cork was that as I got more involved in the scene in the city, like the school itself was incredible, but really by the end of my year there, I was extremely involved in just the local scene and doing gigs and going to shows. And, I would do these gigs where you'd have this really extreme free improvisation, and then you'd have like a jazz set or like a fusion set. And the people who were going to these gigs were musicians, and they were artists, and they were photographers, and they were filmmakers, and there were all these people. And I realized at one point that the only people missing from this community were classical musicians. Like there was no
Mm.
one from the classical world or the contemporary classical world in this scene. And that was a real wake up call to me of like, why do I want my audience to be people who are ingrained in classical music
Yeah.
instead of people who are just ingrained in interesting art? Because I think they're going to be way more interested in and receptive to the type of sound I'm dealing with and the type of music I'm making. And so I think since then I've just tried to keep a really keen eye and ear out for like who are the artists around me who are doing interesting things? Like, can I collaborate with them, or can I just be in community with them? And I think that's certainly served me very well in New Orleans. And I think the project with Kat was just one of the first projects that I actually like, where that really manifested truly. And Kat has become an extremely close friend and close collaborator. She's now doing a PhD in North Carolina, and she's
Mm.
like deputized me to do some field recording for her here because she's like, I need
Awesome.
recordings of my family's house. Could you go take some recordings for me? So that's just been a really like a valuable relationship to cultivate, and a really rewarding way to think about what I'm doing as an artist besides just writing pieces for other performers.
I love what you're talking about, and I can totally relate because I think about 6 or 7 years ago, this feeling unlocked within me, and it's not too different from what you're describing to where I decided I think I prefer rather than being a composer among other composers or classical musicians, quote unquote classical musicians. I think I belong in a community of people making all kinds of different things, whether
Yeah,
that's, artists, visual artists or chefs or, and I guess now that I'm saying this out loud and thinking about it out loud, that's kind of what sparked my interest in doing a podcast like this, where I don't just talk to
totally.
composers, but I talk to people who do all kinds of things. At least that's my plan. And some of the projects that I was doing and Susanna and I were collaborating on at that time in Tampa. For example, we ran a music series, really an event series called Terroir New Music, where
Hmm.
we paired the music of living composers with locally brewed beer or
Oh,
locally
cool.
like
Yeah.
local chef menus and stuff like that. And we found in talking to our classical musician friends who maybe were involved with the orchestra or just people that went to the school, and played in the ensembles there, they really didn't seem interested in what we were doing.
Right. Yeah.
It
And
was
it's
like,
like, it's
yeah,
perplexing to me. It's like, especially people in new music, it's like, come on. Like,
yeah,
but I think it's indicative of like part of this is education and whatnot, but it's indicative of how much the academy and the tradition of classical music is still like where new music is ingrained.
yeah,
And I think it's really to the detriment of new music. There's a practical element to it, I suppose. Like, you can't just pick anyone off the street and ask them to play like highly complicated notated music, right? That is a skill set, but it's very frustrating that it's so insular. And in a way, and maybe it's just like, if you're studying art, by default, you're being exposed to a ton of different media and disciplines in art, right? You could be a sculptor or a photographer or a painter or a digital artist.
right,
And in some ways, each of those are their own community and with their own traditions and their own approach to craft. But because there's so many of them, there's such a wonderful confluence of like sharing and
mm,
potential collaboration, even if it doesn't happen, just sort of being around people doing stuff different from you. Yeah, I'm like sorry to hear that you had that experience as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't categorize it as a negative experience. It was just a very unusual thing to realize,
Yeah.
to kind of acknowledge and confront. Um, because I went through the same kinds of programs that a lot of these people went through, and I think what we decided, Suzanne and I decided, which not to psychoanalyze people, but it just kind of came down to like we figured they just lacked a little bit of curiosity. Like they're not interested in really exploring other things and the things
Yep.
that we're, and that's okay. But those have ended up not being people I surround myself with. That's
Yeah.
all it comes down to.
Yep. Absolutely. I totally agree.
So one of the questions that I ask everybody, what would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice?
I think in many ways it's the things we've been talking about. So certainly improvisation has wormed its way into everything that I
Yeah,
do. I think in some ways just cultivating the knowledge that I've been lucky enough to gain from all these different experiences, which sounds maybe a little flimsy, but it's hard to put it any other way because in a sense, like the fact that I'm really the fact that I'm very aware of engraving rules is very important to making my scores look good, even though I'm making scores that are purposefully not like traditional scores.
sure. Yeah,
So I think that just and cultivating that curiosity, I think in the last few years has become increasingly important to my practice. Curiosity about other disciplines. Like I love reading or listening to interviews about artists and their craft in other arts disciplines. Like the author George Saunders has a book called A Swim in a Pond in the Rain.
yeah,
And it's basically a book about the class that he teaches at either Syracuse or Rochester. I can never remember where he teaches, but he teaches a class on short story writing, which is sort of his bag, like it's what he does. And he teaches it through Russian short stories. And so this book is basically you read this story from like Gogol or Tolstoy or Chekhov, and then he writes a chapter about how he talks about the craft of
mm,
that story with his students. And I love that. And being in the class I mentioned, the theater class in Cork, watching theater artists think about devising pieces. So rather than just like writing a script and then performing it, but sort of, and they call it devising, like large scale theatrical works that have some text, have a lot of motion, might have some sound. That was really influential to me too. So I think that has become a real pillar for me is always seeking out information about other artists and
yeah.
trying to be better about like engrossing myself in other arts. Like I've been doing a lot of film photography in the last few years, and that has been such an interesting thing because it started as a hobby, but because I am who I am, I'm like, I want to know. Like
Yeah.
I want to know how this works, why this works, when this works. And then learning that has made me so much more appreciative of photography in general and thinking about what are the aesthetic priorities of a photographer, what how are they seeing the world? That has become really critical to my practice as well.
So I know from following you on Instagram and social media that of this interest of yours in film photography, and so when you were talking about field recording, I immediately made that connection in my mind. Like it's kind
Yeah.
of it. I'm sure it occupies like a similar space. And you also talk on your website about your interest in writing and how that's a big part of your identity.
Yeah.
So can you kind of discuss the role that these things have in shaping who you are in general? And how does
Yeah.
this work? How does this work in tandem with your composing, or maybe even how does it fulfill something that composing can't fulfill?
That's such a good question. And I think in a lot of ways that is what's happening is that like one of the things I love about film photography is the process of it is so different from the process of composing. Like when you're setting up for a shot, you scope things out, you try to get your settings to where you think they need to be, you try to get the right framing in the right position, but then you take the shot and it's over. Like, and you won't know how it turned out for
Yeah.
however long it takes you to send your film to the lab and get your scans back. And I love that sense of like being divorced from the final product and being forced into just awareness of the process. That has been really wonderful for me. I think it's helped in a lot of ways unblock, compositional blocks if I have them, just from a process perspective. The writing, uh, I think for me, so I've always been a big reader and I've always liked writing. And I think I started writing just because when I was in grad school, I Care If You Listen put out a call
Mm.
for contributors, and I threw my name in the hat and I wrote for them for many years. And then when I was in Ireland, I wrote a review of New Music Dublin. The guy who ran New Music Dublin saw it, he liked it. He asked me to write a piece on his behalf for an Irish publication later. I wrote for Vanessa Aggie for The Road to Sound, and I think there were a few things happening there. One was just it was a way for me to always be listening to things, to be doing something else. But another part of it was there was sort of that practical, like, especially when I was in grad school, feeling like I needed to cultivate every skill I could so that because I don't think I ever imagined that I'd be able to do composing full time. And I I've always had a very very tangible awareness of work and money and financial
Yeah.
security. And so I think the writing in one way was like, well, if I cultivate this, this becomes another facet of my identity that people can call on for me. What it became, I think, really importantly, was a reckoning with how I listen. I think instinctively as a listener, I certainly have opinions about what draws me and what doesn't, what I think works and what doesn't. But when I was writing like album reviews, especially, I realized like, okay, if I don't like this, I really need to be clear about what I think is missing here because
Yeah.
it would be a disservice to me and to the artist if I'm just sort of like, oh, this is bad because I don't like it. It's like, no, you need to listen for what moment is drawing you away from the music.
Mm.
Like, what is the thing you're hearing that makes this less successful than another potential version of this? And I think that was really important for me to go through. I think it helped how I listen.
I think maybe you've answered my next question in some ways, but I'm going to ask you more directly. But what is a piece of music or a song, a book, a piece of art, anything like that that changed the way you thought about your work?
So I've been thinking about this because I listened to the podcast. And I mean, I think as so many composers and musicians, like there's obviously endless number of influences. I think there are maybe three pieces of music or three musical concepts that were like there was before I heard this piece and there was
Yeah.
after I heard this piece. The first one is that when I was in high school, I mentioned like at the end of high school, I decided maybe I want to do composition. One of the things I did was I took lessons very briefly with a composer in Pittsburgh. And this was when I knew like nothing about classical music. And so he was introducing like he was like, "Oh, do you know Mahler?" I was like, "No, I don't know who's that." Like, what's and
Yeah.
so he was introducing me to like Mahler and Shostakovich and people like that. But he also showed me Macrocosmos by George Crumb,
Yeah.
and he showed me the score. And that was the first time I had seen like a truly handwritten score. I mean, obviously George Crumb occupies this place for contemporary music that we're all familiar with, but it was like the first time seeing no bar lines and no meter, the first time seeing no key signature, the first time seeing a piece that and actually what really was important to me was the space of that piano suite that George Crumb cultivates is so evocative. Like to
Mm.
to my ear, it's still like my favorite George Crumb piece. And I remember the teacher saying like, look, I know that this sounds like just like rumbling low notes, but these are not random. Like he's choosing the chords here. And seeing that that was possible, and hearing like, oh my god, like you can make music that sounds like this, was just really profound. Did I start writing music like that? No, but it
Yeah.
really, I think, triggered a really keen interest in like, I didn't know this was possible and now I do, and I need to know more. The other piece that was like that for me was Kit's Beach Soundwalk by Hildegard Westerkamp, which I didn't hear until I was in Cork. And so, I'd gone through all of this contemporary classical training, listened to so much wonderful music, and had changed so much as a person and as a composer. And Kit's Beach Soundwalk, for those who aren't familiar, is a electronic, like it's a piece for tape where basically Hildegard Westerkamp is on the beach in Vancouver and she's recording the waves and she's narrating her experience of doing this. And she's sort of, and she's not just narrating it, but she's also narrating the technology behind it. And she does these things of like, I can trick you and make you think that the waves are this loud, and then she turns the volume up on the
Mm.
track. It's like, or but it's actually like this. And she goes through this just beautiful sequence of, these are the sounds around me. This is what I want to listen to. Now that I'm listening to this sound, what is it evoking in my mind? And just that piece, like, first of all, it's so beautiful. I play it for every class that I teach. And it was also one of the first times I heard a piece of sonic art that I was like, I mean, this isn't a composition really, but it's so evocative. Like, it is such a moving sonic piece of art.
Mm.
And
Right.
and it really opened my ears to like the ways that you can think about sound in art making and the ways that you can think about aesthetic experience. Some other big ones, like I think I mentioned I did my undergrad thesis on Ulysses, and that was less of a like in the moment impact. That was more of a, once I worked through that book, realizing like, okay, this changes how I engage with art now, because this was such a dedicated process and such
Yeah.
a new thing. Yeah, and I think learning about Fluxus in Cork actually really had an impact on me, because I think something that's not often discussed about Fluxus is sort of the humor and the levity of Fluxus. And that, to me, what Fluxus was so good about is encouraging you to find the art in everyday life.
Yeah.
And the piece of like, I forget who wrote it, but one of the Fluxus pieces is like, make a salad. And
Yeah.
my professor was like, okay, so yeah, obviously it's just like make a salad, but there's something a little bit more interesting about that salad now. And I think that that really affected just how I engage with the world around me, and trying to find beauty and find art in the everyday, and just being appreciative, and as you said earlier, being curious.
Yeah, I love that. So before our interview, you shared with me that you've been working for a tech company for the past 4.5 years. So, in other words, you live that kind of day job, quote unquote, life
I
as a
do.
composer. And I'm really interested in exploring this just a little more with you, because that's been my life for some time now too.
Right.
And there's a lot of balancing and juggling, and there's a lot that goes into that I think a lot of, like, we don't really talk about
Right.
in academia or even among each other in our community of as composers. So can you talk about how you've been able to balance your non-creative work with this tech company with all the other creative work that you do, because you also
Yeah,
teach?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so in some ways, it's just like I'm a glutton for punishment, and
Yeah.
but this is important too, because I think I've had to learn that and learn how to balance against it. So, yeah, I mean, so when I moved to New Orleans, I did not have a job lined up. I was finishing my degree in Cork, and my wife was down here already, so I was moving down here. And, you know, as I've mentioned repeatedly, I didn't feel I had the skills that most musicians leverage to get musician jobs, right? Like I couldn't go gig. I had a church choir gig, but that's just once a week. I was not at that time facile enough with music technology to do like sound or mixing or like audio editing. And the thing about like stringing together a freelance career, which is so viable in so many ways and for so many people, is that you can only do that if you have the time to do it. Like, and not just the time to do the work itself, but the time to set up that work for
Mm.
yourself. And so, and I didn't have that time. Like our financial situation was such that like I needed a job where I was making a paycheck every other week, and like we had bills to pay, and also like we needed healthcare, like we were
Right.
aging out of our parents' health insurance. So when I first got to New Orleans, I was working these two just very draining part-time jobs. I was working like 50 hours a week. And then right before the pandemic hit, I got this job at a tech company as a proposal writer. And I've been at this company ever since. And it was like a salary. It wasn't huge. When I started, I was making $40,000 a year, which is like nothing, but it seemed like the world when I started.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I also had healthcare and I had flexible PTO. And as the pandemic hit, it shifted to fully remote work, and it's been fully remote work ever since. And it's been really interesting. I think so maybe I'll just start with the timeline. So I did that. I've since moved into a different role, but still in the same company. In 2021, I also started teaching adjunct at Tulane. And that was another like, this is something that I can cultivate for my future. Like, oh, I didn't do any TAing when I was in grad school. Like, let me take these
Mm.
courses in like intro to music tech, and that'll be my teaching experience. And that was a lot. And that was really where the balance question started to become an issue, because during the pandemic, because I was working remotely and because no one was doing anything, I was in the very fortunate position to have financial security and time. So I actually wrote a lot during the pandemic. When I started teaching, pretty much all of my time and energy shifted to teaching. So I'm working a full time job during the day. I'm teaching two sections of a course each semester. And I basically didn't compose anything for 2 years. To me, it felt like the only thing I was doing was either improv gigs in the city, which were occasional, and it's like not doing it for the money, all the tens of dollars I
Right.
was making. Um, or I was lucky that I had a few performers who were continuing to play previous pieces of mine. And that was like a really that was a real challenge, and I learned a lot from that. And the crux of this was last year. While I was doing these things, I also copy edited a book. And for about a month, I was either working or asleep.
Yeah.
And that was when I was like, this is not right. Like, I think I had been trying to collect because I had always been in a position where it's like, you can't just live like freelance. You need to work, like you need to have an income. And I had always looked to opportunities to supplement that income or diversify it so that maybe I could move things around and spend more time composing. And what I realized was like, I'm preparing myself for a future that I'm going to live through if I don't change anything right now.
Yeah.
So that was a big thing about balance, because in so many ways, working a remote job is good. Like you can get the benefits, and if you're working for a company that is respectful, and mine is, like I've always been very transparent about my creative work, and they've always been very encouraging of it. It does give you in some ways a lot of security that frees up your mental space to do the creative work.
Right. Yeah.
But if it's demotivating work, it could sap all that energy on the other side. or if you're working too much, like you can't, it's often been the case for me where it's like, well, I can either exercise or I can compose. And it's like, I really would like to be healthy, but I would
Yeah.
also really like to have time to compose. And so I got to an extreme point in terms of time commitments and have started scaling back to somewhere that's more, I think, that enables me to actually be creating and not just be trying to set myself up for some future where I don't have to work as much and can create more.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. I completely feel you. And yeah, I've struggled with like bouts of burnout myself.
Mhm.
Most recently this week actually, I kind of acknowledged like, "Oh, this feeling, I know this feeling. I know
Yeah.
what it is."
Yeah.
And kind of, the problem with me is that above anything else, I identify as a composer. I think
Right.
I wish that I could sustain an entire living with all the financial security and the benefits and all that kind of stuff. I think as we all wish we could do that
Right.
as just being a composer, but the reality of it is that that's very very rarely a thing for anybody. I mean, you
Right.
have to be I mean, even, we see Pulitzer Prize winners, like, they still teach at universities,
So
right?
this
So
is yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot too because I think, I'm about to start a PhD in the fall, and for most of my schooling, my assumption was like, well, even if I take time off, I'll go back and do a PhD and then I'll be a professor and I'll teach and I'll compose, whatever.
yeah,
And one of the things that I've witnessed being an adjunct is that, like, there are ways in which the structure of academia allows you to be creative, but in a lot of other ways, being a professor is also the job that's preventing you from
yeah,
composing.
right.
And I think, especially with how tenuous academia is and can be, and unfortunately increasingly seems like it is, I don't think there's anything wrong with, like, just like finding security in any job where you don't hate yourself, you
Mhm,
don't hate what you're doing, and you have what you need to sustain your life. Like, I have a friend, Alexis Enyart, and the last time I saw her, she said something like, music can be a great career, but it's not always a great life. And
yeah,
if you start feeling like you have to make music your life, you might be in trouble
mhm,
because unless you're truly cream of the crop, most successful, like got all the opportunities coming in, you probably need something else to make your life a life.
yeah,
And sometimes that's financial, sometimes it's just like not always being in music all the time, and that I think is such a succinct way to put it, that like there's no problem with like cultivating a life that gives you the creative time to work but also lets you be secure. And it feels like increasingly security is like you need it.
yeah, and there is, as you alluded to, there is a liberation there where,
Yeah.
if you don't have to be cranking out commissions to survive, if you're surviving by means of something else that doesn't depend on your creative work necessarily, you have liberation in that you can take on the projects that you really want to take on. You can write the
Right.
kind of music. I remember when I got commissioned to write an orchestra piece for the USF Symphony Orchestra in about 2018, 2019. I was full-time salaried benefits at my job at that point,
Right.
and the conductor was basically like, "Yeah, write whatever you want." And I really had to sit down and think to myself like, "What what do I want to write?" Like
Right.
this is like one of those opportunities you don't get to write an orchestra piece
Right.
that often.
Right.
It was my other than the stuff the garbage orchestra piece I wrote in grad school
Right.
for like a reading, right? Like this was my first
Yes. I
opportunity.
also have my grad school reading piece and
Y-
my
y- Yeah,
actual orchestra
yeah,
piece.
right. And so, it came down to like, I hope this will get played again, but I'm not gonna count on that. And I guess I don't care if it does. I'm gonna write the piece I want to write,
Yeah.
and that's what I did, and I'm very happy with it,
Yeah.
and it hasn't been played again, but that's okay.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of conventional wisdom in our community about how you spend your time. And look, there are limitations to doing this. Like I can't I can't just not show up to work because I have rehearsal. Like
Yeah.
it means I can't go to rehearsal or I can't do XYZ thing. But I think, actually living in New Orleans, I think has made this less of a problem because New Orleans as a city is not a place where people care about the work you do. Like obviously I also think of myself as a composer and as that being sort of my primary non-James or in addition to James identity.
Yeah.
And New Orleans is obviously full of musicians, but New Orleans is just a creative city. Like when Mardi Gras comes, everyone is in a costume. And it doesn't matter if you are like an elementary school teacher or you work at a bank or you work for a like everyone has just spent the last month building some elaborate costume.
Yeah.
And the best part of the city is seeing everyone's creativity and sharing in everyone's creativity. And it's a city where like it might take 3 meetings for you to get to the question of like, so wait, how do you actually make money? Like what do you what do you
Yeah,
do?
right.
Because it's just people don't care. And I think it's such a healthy I wish there were more places everywhere, but especially in the US where it's like you're not defined by your work, you're defined by your interest. And yeah, it's like I can very comfortably say, "Oh yeah, I'm a composer. I work for a tech company full time, but yeah, I'm a composer and I don't have any feelings of like insecurity about claiming that even though there have been times where I haven't done much composing."
Yeah, it would be fantastic for us all to acknowledge the realities that we live
Yeah.
in the composition community,
Yeah.
because again, I feel like there's never really a space to talk about it, and more often than not I feel like people see me, doing the radio thing, like, oh, he does the radio thing, and it's like, no, I'm a composer. Like, yes, I do the radio thing, but
Yeah.
that's kind of secondary to everything else.
Yeah.
So anyway, not to be a bummer about it.
But I think I think that maybe to put a final positive spin on it is that like that sense of is it your career or is it your life? Like what are you cultivating? Are you
Yeah.
cultivating your career or are you cultivating your life? And sometimes you can do both, but um I've been trying to prioritize like I'm going to cultivate my life
Yeah.
and I'm going to try to make my life something that I'm really excited about living in and that I feel comfortable living in both like philosophically and practically. And like I'm going to detach my happiness about my creative work from my productivity as a creator and attach it to the experiences I have as a creator. And if I'm having experiences that fulfill me as a creator, and I'll obviously try to pursue them in a way that I can share them and have people hear them, but I'm going to focus on being comfortable first.
Yeah, that's good stuff. What do you think you would be doing if it wasn't your art? And I'm also going to say not your tech company job either with this
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so something I'm thinking about as I enter a PhD is like, what do I want to do after? And I don't necessarily know that it would be teaching. And one of the things that I've increasingly become aware of is like, oh, it's like sound and technology are so a part of our lives that there are ways to be involved with that aren't necessarily being a like sort of ideating creator.
Yeah, right.
Um, like there was a job posting recently for a a research fellow with the company that built the Sphere in Las Vegas. The like
Amazing.
giant eyeball in the middle
Yes.
of but the position was to work on their protocols for spatial audio because like obviously you need that to
Yeah.
create that immersive media experience, and it was like a really well paid position, like 6 figures and above, like not
Mm,
more than 6 figures, but it was like healthy 6 figure position. I was like, why wouldn't I want to do that? So
right. Yeah.
I think that there actually is work in the world that I would really love doing where it's not like I would way rather do that than like write movie music at this point in my life,
Yeah.
or like be an orchestrator for an orchestra. I think that that is more compelling to me as work and as an activity that I would engage in. More idealistically, like I've always written a lot, so it would be lovely to be a writer in some capacity. And when I was in college, I started out actually as a math major before I switched the math degree to an English degree. And that was actually so that I could study astronomy because I love
Mm.
space. So yeah, I don't know. I think at the time I saw it as a limitation, but now it's one of my favorite parts about me is that I am curious about a lot of things. And I think there was a world in which I studied like political science. Or there was a world in which I studied physics. There was a world in which I maybe more purposefully studied technology because the role I have at my tech company is not one that's based on like developing a product. It's based on other company
Yeah.
things. But I like to think that in relation to the conversation we just had, that matters less and less because whatever I do in my life and whatever I would have done, I hope that it's one that's allowing me to cultivate things I care about, whether it's in work or outside of work, and just like building a cohesive and full life that has a lot of different facets in it. And whatever the one that makes me live or allows me to live,
Yeah.
I want it to be something I care about, but I want more that the rest of my life I'm surrounded by things I care about.
Is there a tool that you use in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from?
Well, one thing that surprises people is all those like graphic scores I've made, except for one, I just made in Sibelius. So I
Oh,
just
really?
like all the notation, like anthrophony is completely Sibelius except for like two lines and that I imported as graphics.
Yeah.
So I think one thing is that, and I mean, I don't know that I would recommend everyone has to learn how to use notation programs in this way. But for me, the things that like a notation program can be hacked and like the things manipulated to be almost more like a graphics editor.
Mm.
And so I think that everyone can stand to be a lot more imaginative with how they engage with some of the basic tools that we all use. And it takes some doing, like you have to practice with it a bit. But certainly for creating my scores, I'm still just like I use Sibelius and then maybe we'll add some extra graphics at the end in a like illustration program. A big one for me is just like taking a walk. Like the writer Rebecca Solnit has a book called Wanderlust, and the book is sort of a history of walking. But in the intro to her book, she says something at one point that was like, I sat down to start working on this intro and immediately got back up to go on a walk because a desk is no place for big ideas.
Mm.
I was like, I've never wanted to put a quote up on my desk, but that would be the top
Yeah.
contender for like things I need to remind myself of. So yeah, going on like a walk in the morning is a big part of what I do these days just to help think through like if I'm working on a project, think through the next steps in the project, try to imagine other possibilities for the project. In some ways, I actually feel like I have a lack of tools, if I could change anything about my practice, it would be to have a more consistent like workflow or a more consistent setup of like I open Ableton or I open Reaper and then I have these MIDI instruments and my keyboard is already set up and plugged in and it's correctly positioned so that I can do microtonal stuff. Like I think that there's one of the things I struggle with is actually every time I feel like I need a tool like that to help do something, I feel like I have to create it or I have
Yeah.
to go find it for the first time. And I do wish I had a little bit more consistency. But then, you know, one of the other things I do use a lot and it's very important for my improv is Max MSP. Like all of my
Yeah.
improvising goes through a Max MSP patch. And that is a place where I have to a degree been able to build some of those tools for myself. And when I can really get into the like experimentation and playfulness of coding in Max, it's great. And when I feel like I'm stuck in the, oh, what object does that again? I don't remember. That's when I'm like, this isn't worth
Yeah.
it.
I built myself a max patch for my day-to-day radio work.
Oh,
That's just like
nice.
a sampler basically, but it lets me kind of quickly and efficiently record all my voice tracks and stuff
Yeah.
like that. And other people who work in radio will ask me like, "What software do you use to record?" And then I'm like, "Oh no, I don't know how to answer this because it's like this software I use as a composer, but
Yeah, it's like I made my
adapted."
I programmed a bespoke tool for
Yeah, yeah,
one of the things I love about Max is that like you can literally do anything. Like
yeah,
you don't have to do the composerly things that
right.
most people do with it. Like I met someone in grad school when I was in grad school came and did a presentation where he like works for a 3D modeling company and he runs all of his software through Max patches he built.
Wow.
Um
Yeah,
and in the realm of like jobs I could have that are about sound, nowadays doing sound design for electric vehicles is a huge industry because you have to have certain sonic indicators because the engine is gone. And one of the companies I found, they prototype all of their stuff in Max.
that's amazing to hear.
Yeah, I was like, "Oh, that is fascinating." Like, but it makes
Yeah,
sense. Like, why would you spend your time like doing line code when you have a much more interactive tool
mm,
to set up these things? And then when it's in place, you can build the code
right.
that to replicate it in the system you need it.
That's amazing. Maybe I should do
It's cool. I'm
that.
like, that's on my list of I'm gonna check in with you in like 3.5 years and
Yeah,
see what's going on.
yeah, exactly. So my final question for you is pretty much your chance to say whatever else you want to say. And that is, what is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
I guess what I feel like is I don't have specific things about my music that I'm like, "Oh, people just don't understand that this is what I like," or like, "This is what I want." I
Yeah,
think, the people who I'm working with get what I'm doing either because I've explained it to them or because they work in similar ways or have similar interests. I guess the thing that it's not about like convincing people about this in my art, but just hoping that more people could adopt this as their own perspective is just a, especially in classical music and new music, like a willingness to find depth of meaning in places that aren't concerts, that aren't scores, that aren't, or if they are scores, like I think this is a big motivator for how I build my scores is like I still want you to have a complex artistic experience when you're putting this piece together, even though you are not rehearsing time and you're not rehearsing pitch. And I think that that is an artistic view that has been increasingly important to me and increasingly important to how I compose. But I think it's also just a life view. Like one of the things that was great about learning soundscape composition is that the composition, like the art part of it, was the beginning, but the end was this sort of like, it was one of the first like digital humanities projects, right? It was this
yeah.
first, it was an early way to use aesthetic experience to learn about the world around you. And I think that that is just such a like engrossing and fascinating way to think about the world and to learn about the world. And I'm always looking for ways to make experiences that encourage connections and help to shift perspective on your relationship to either art or to an actual thing not that art isn't an actual thing,
Yeah.
but to another topic, like maybe a more scholarly topic. And I don't feel like that sort of unified and pervasive approach is very present in a lot of new music.
Yeah.
And I wish that it was. And I think that it would be to the benefit of everyone if it was.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, James, this conversation has been like a journey that I've really loved being on.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for your time and for sharing your story, your process, and yeah, I can't wait to talk more. I'm sure we'll have more to talk about in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tyler.
All right, so I have an admission to make that might be a little bit surprising. What you just heard was the very first time James and I have ever talked to one another outside of, the occasional messages on social media. And like I said in the beginning, I could have talked to him all day long. Just loads of good stuff right there. You can learn more about James and listen to some of his music. Check out those beautiful scores of his that we talked about and lots more on his website, jamesmaycomposer.com. I'm Tyler Kline, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. We're online at looseleaftransmissions.com. You can find more episodes of the podcast as well as ways to support us on that website. That's all I've got today. Take care, and I'll see you here next time.